Today's session is on governance, explainability, and accountability. And I mean, we've done your readings. We've talked a lot about this already through the other days, and so I think we'll be bringing some of this stuff together. But I thought we would start by asking the question, why? Why do we want governance, explainability, accountability? There was also some feedback from all of you that you wanted to have more group conversations and have it a little bit more interactive. So we will try to respond to that. And we'll try to respond to that by starting out by asking you guys a question and trying to get some thoughts. I mean, maybe you can pull from your readings, pull from other parts of your body. Well, why? Yeah. Sorry, hold on.
Okay, well, at a minimum, I want procedural and substantive due process. I want the constitutional requirements to be met, and explainability is part of the due process requirement in the right contexts.
So can you or somebody else, for the non-legal folks, describe due process succinctly? Any constitutional law students?
What?
Go for it, Gretchen. Or we were talking. So due process is a set of procedures based in the, depends on what court you're talking about. But in essence, due process is a set of procedures that are based in the history of the country that are guaranteed under the Fifth Amendment of the Constitution for the federal government or the 14th for the states that are required for to go through a process to have the government take away some of your rights.
So before we even say what that is, it was sounding possible, like Gretchen was saying, anytime maybe some of these systems that we've been talking about get used, due process is owed. But you just described it in terms of things the government owes people when the government does something.
Yes, so due process only, unless there's like an agent of the government thing going on, so the government hires somebody to do something to you. It's the Constitution protects due process
So
versus
Facebook doesn't owe you due process under the Constitution.
Correct, nor does it owe you freedom of speech or anything else.
So unpack due process a little bit more. So what does due process sort of literally mean? Maybe we could use an example.
So is it Eldridge? Am I getting that right? US v. Eldridge, that basic due process and administrative concerns.
I teach torts, but hit us with procedural due process.
So procedural due process, examples of it would be you have access to an unbiased, a neutral arbiter of some sort, oftentimes a judge, but for an administrative proceeding, it could be a neutral employee of the agency. It could be you have the right to have the decision, a reasoned decision explained to you, so the judge or whomever has to actually write down, this is my decision and these are the reasons why. It could be something along the lines of what capabilities do you have to argue for your case, either yourself by having access to certain evidence or by having access to an advocate who can explain on behalf. So due process essentially is a set of guaranteed procedures that are used to make sure your ability to participate in a proceeding is fair, the people making the decision on the proceeding is fair, and you have fair notice over what's necessary to win that proceeding, and then at the end, why you won or lost that proceeding. In essence, one way it's put is due process is such that even if you caught me on tape confessing to stealing from a store, I still have certain due process guarantees that I can participate in the adjudication against me as the government tries to take away my life and my liberty.
So these are sort of like rules of engagement that we've determined are considered fair, and your right to validate somehow that these processes have been followed. Is that roughly?
Less fair and more, I think the right word would be just here.
Just? Okay.
So like if you have me on tape killing somebody, it's not really fair that I should have this due process, but systematically it is just that those are applied to everyone.
Okay.
That's an incredibly nice summary. I don't know if you were just taking con law, because it sounds really fresh. But the number of rights you're owed may vary from one area to another, the federal government. And again, I think you did a great list. Figuring out what a neutral decision maker is when it's a machine, of course, offers up a huge vacuum for a group like this to try to fill. And then when you talk about reasons, being owed reasons for a decision, that of course opens up the big question of explainability and what counts as a good reason.
And in the readings, I mean, we'll come back to it, but that due process is one of the ways they've been going after, or trying to go after, proprietary algorithms in determining risk scores, right?
Can I say one more thing? And so due process can come from a number of places. So it can come from the Constitution. It can also come from statutes, so Congress or a state legislature passes a law. So when we talk about due process, it's not always just coming from the U.S. Constitution. It can come from any number of other governments.
And it also might be a little meta in that if there is a sequence established, you have to follow the sequence, whatever it is.
Right.
So
just for the video, the point was it doesn't all come from Constitution. It can come
Right.
from statutes and other rules.
It also tends to arise more in certain kinds of potential takings. So there are certain actions the government might take where it might be less likely to arise. 3 examples that come up in specifically what we're talking about. There was an Idaho Medicare case where it was entitlement benefits, so certain kinds of government benefits, and when they were drastically reduced and no explanation was given when asked, that was found to be a violation of due process.
And you don't mean reduced overall for everybody, you mean for a given person.
I mean for a class, it was a class action.
Yeah.
But for a class of...
But not like the legislature cut benefits.
Correct.
Yeah.
Not like that, just the black box algorithm started spitting out numbers that were 25, 30% lower.
Right.
Another is the criminal sentencing applications where a due process argument is made, but not necessarily successful.
Yes.
It was not successful in Loomis. And the first case was Armstrong. Another is there are a number of states that were using evaluations of teachers in firing decisions. And so there have been cases about that, so also when the government is making a firing decision, it can arise. One point about whether or not due process should arise when you have been caught on tape in the context of our class specifically and the time we live in with fake news and what computer-generated images can do now, I think absolutely if you are caught on tape, you want due process because maybe it wasn't you.
Which would be to say, a chance to review the circumstances by which that tape came about, what's the chain of custody, a chance to challenge its basis. But also, again, just before we move on, I want to note that this is generally in the context of government-provided stuff. So one question would be, somehow is this valuable enough that you would determine circumstances where private parties would owe it to one another? And it's also maybe worth noting in some of the reading we had on the GDPR that the piece of the GDPR that people are so excited about having to do with explainability gets attenuated if there's a human in that loop, that makes it less imperative maybe to explain the machine advice to the human decision maker rather than if it's just the algorithm deciding alone. And in the Loomis case, which is the big challenge so far to the risk scores, in the US criminal justice system, I think in Wisconsin, the fact that those scores, when spat out, offered no particular explanation for how they came about was not a big deal under the due process challenge to the Wisconsin Supreme Court because they were merely input to a judge and then the judge explained reasons. So it mirrors the kind of attenuation of the GDPR. So while it sounds great to say, oh, great, reasons, that's what we're talking about, at least so far, the doctrine of due process has not turned out to be a huge factor.
So sort of in addition to these 3 topics that have been discussed, I sort of see this being a subset of explainability, but in the context of algorithmic decision making, I think transparency is also another element of interest. So providing more transparency into sort of how the accuracy level of these algorithms scale across different demographics, different minority groups, being able to provide users a clear understanding of, as you mentioned, how these systems were trained and developed is something that I think is fairly important.
Mm-hmm. And it's important, probably a couple of reasons why, right? So one is sort of bias and so on, accuracy, errors, auditing for security. There's probably a number of reasons for transparency. And we'll talk a little bit more about that, but and then well, I guess we'll talk about it in the next section too, but I think it's important to kind of, and we'll do this a little bit later, is sort of describe what transparency means when you have very complex systems that are pretty difficult for people to understand, right?
It's also, I thought, interesting amidst our readings that transparency is kind of the first go-to. It's the thing that everybody can tend to agree upon, so it's one of the reasons you go to it first. But I don't know if you found it interesting, the degree of skepticism within the readings that we happen to assign of just how far transparency can go in improving or dealing with the problems you see.
Yeah, I mean, I won't name which board I'm on, but I was on a board.
You
and
should be transparent, Joe.
you can go to my website and you can see it. But we asked a question that was fairly straightforward, and we got 900 pages and 3 hours of explanation as the answer, with full transparency, but completely, unable to digest as in a useful way. And so I think transparency is pretty interesting because it can be somewhat mechanically interpreted to mean just give you all the data without really the tool to parse
If we played word association with the phrase pure tech health, would your associated word be yes or no?
I'm not going to give you any signal on this, so don't try.
Well, I went to the website.
Okay, any other reasons we would want this?
So this is not exactly a reason, but this is a question that's been plaguing me for a little while. From a cognitive psychology perspective, this whole business of decision making and what are good decisions, and especially in the context of, for example, courts and meting out sentences and stuff. Like there's a famous example that comes from Kahneman and Tversky. They talk about how two German judges were asked to give shoplifters a sentence, and it turns out that they were asked to roll a die beforehand, and it turns out that the higher the number on the die, the higher the sentence they meted out to the person in front of them, which is basically an argument that says that human decision making is extremely error prone, right, and is biased by random occurrences such as rolling dice. And so it seems like we have a more, we hold algorithms more accountable to making better decisions than we hold human beings. And I wonder if there could be in the future perhaps a study that, like a more longitudinal kind of study that says well, how often do algorithms get it wrong and how often do human beings get it wrong, and sort of compare those two.
Yeah, I was reading up on forensic psychology, and I see this, not being a lawyer, I see this as an opportunity to overhaul the legal system for all of the fallibilities of humans that we're just discovering. And there's, two, I can send the links if people are interested, but there's two pretty wonderful studies. One, which is an old study, but it basically says type on the keyboard, but just don't hit this key or you're going to crash the computer. And then they just crash the computer. And the majority of people, by asking them certain questions in a certain way, can be convinced that they actually did touch the key. And so overall, basically, by asking questions in a certain way, you can usually convince people that they've done something that they didn't do. And then there's another really interesting case where there was actually a forensic psychologist, I think, who was tried as a suspect for rape. And he had an alibi because he was on live TV as this rape was supposedly to have occurred. And after going in and digging around, they realized that he was on TV just as the rape was occurring, and there's a particular kind of problem that happens, which is apparently, there's a name for it, I don't remember the name, which is you sort of associate two memories and you match them together by accident, and you're sort of convinced that that person was the person that caused the thing. And so there are all these really interesting neurological errors that we have, and also our inability to actually have memories that are very persistent or very good. And so when you start to look at the fallibility of the brain.
Just to be clear here you're claiming that the victim was watching him on TV, which is why the victim.
Yeah, the victim saw them on TV, and then the rape occurred, which was traumatic enough to mix up the memory and then attach his face.
I just want to make sure the story was complete.
Yeah, sorry. And so, but mainly that you can be absolutely convinced of a truth under oath and have it be completely wrong, and that we're starting to understand the underlying mechanisms and actually the fundamental weakness and fallibility of memory. And so it's interesting because we depend a lot on things like witnesses and lie detectors, and we're also seeing some of the problems with DNA tests. So a lot of the truths that we have in process seem to be under question. And then to your point, we're holding machines to a very high standard. What do we think about that? What's the ultimate utility?
Well, what I like about that point is it's a nice reminder that we focus, and even here in this session we framed it as what are the big problems with this stuff and what do we do about it? And it's a reminder that the technology can offer a number of opportunities for improving the sad state that we're in. The only defense of it is it's all we've got. Like, we can't turn it over to crickets to decide. It's got to be humans, and so we've got problems. I was going to ask back to the room, just to carry forward one more beat on this thread of procedural due process and explainability, on the idea that maybe reasons are rationalizations rather than, this is the die experiment, rather than actually causing the judgment that a person renders in a government capacity. Would it be okay to have a judge, a human judge, behold a situation and have to render a judgment on it and be like, yeah, guilty, or whatever, to, cut the benefit, some decision, and then be able to ask a machine learning or other system to write the reasons? Say, the decision was rendered yes, please write a compelling statement of why that is so that adds up. And let us suppose that when you read it, it does add up. Would that be okay, or would that feel like an awful system if we disconnect the generation of the reasons from the person who made the decision?
Is that what lawyers do?
Well, my follow-up question was going to be, how do you feel about your clerks if you're a judge? So you've jumped to the chase, unfortunately. But I'm curious if there's any difference between using the machine to do it and asking your clerks to write the first draft of an opinion, which is what 99% of judges do. Yeah.
So I think that also relates to the point that.
Oh, you're not going to answer that question?
No, yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, definitely, we are going to answer it, hopefully.
Oh.
So basically, we don't know what value systems the judge has or
Yes.
the machine has, or how it sort of reasons about it. And I think that's a general ethical framework problem. Even if the process is very efficient, how does the machine think about what assumptions to start with?
Oh, I assume we poured into the machine all the con law books, all the cases. Like, we just poured words into the machine called the law.
It's commonly called the sum of all human knowledge.
The sum of all human knowledge. And now the machine spits out facsimiles of opinions that bear a lot of resemblance to existing opinions, which is why if a law professor or lawyer reading it saw it, would be like, yeah, that adds up. Those seem like good reasons for the opinion. That opinion is consistent with the law.
But are you saying that the judge makes the decision beforehand? And
Yes.
But if that's the case, how do we then check if
Well, that's the
judge
question, right?
uses
The
a
judge may
framework?
flip a coin, and then the machine rationalizes it.
Yeah.
But the rationalization is so rational that it's very hard to argue. Is that fair? Is that sort of what you're asking?
Yeah, and I think, it's a question about what due process is really guaranteeing here. Is it like, I am due reasons, or like, reasons are ready, they're just out of the microwave, or are they, no, the reasons are not the thing, the reasons are the signifier to the fact that the decision maker was being neutral and rational, and if you disconnect the reasons from the decision maker, those reasons are awful. They look like delicious reasons, but they're not. They're styrofoam. I'm really mixing metaphors like crazy here, but somehow just wherever the mic is going.
I was just thinking that in response to your question, we know that the sum of all human knowledge will always be able to come up with whatever answer, whatever reasons. No, that's how it works.
This
right?
is, by the way, called legal realism. Yes.
You could always, thank you. You would always be able to find some data to make a compelling case for some outcome that you had decided. But if you have humans making those decisions, don't you also bake in the ability for someone who thinks something is, I don't know how this actually works, but if you felt something was really wrong, right? So you were told by a judge or a clerk to say, this is what we've decided, go find the reasons. And they were going through and they were like, actually, I want to dispute that or I disagree, that you actually do have a different type of check and balance versus when you have a machine do something, you'll always be able to find, the machine will always be able to come up with answers. So I do think that there is something different there, personally.
And just to add a little bit of a cynical neuroscience thing, there is a lot of evidence that we actually do make up the reasons after we make the decisions, and that our consciousness is just an after-the-fact rationalization machine. So we might already be there.
Yeah, to follow on, I think another part of it is, like in our current legal system, we have appealability, and the reasons have to be persuasive enough that it convinces the next guy who maybe is not a robot. So I don't know, like I would have much less issue with that, especially given the entire there being clerks thing. I realize I'm changing the hypo slightly, but if there's a level of appealability, then like, is there a set of reasons that rationalize this decision? Because the fact that it went to court, it could have gone either way. And the judge made a decision, whatever inputs he had, he has some system, whether clerks or AI, decide on some legal basis for it. And then we have the next level. And I don't know, like I think if there's a check, I wouldn't have that much of an issue with it.
It's also worth pointing out that legislatures don't owe the kinds of due process rights that judges do. In the 1920s, there was a brief flourishing of something called legislative due process, which it might be time to bring back. But at the moment, it's dead letter. And it's also why often when doing a constitutional review in the US of what a legislature, say Congress, has done, the typical test is called rational basis. And it's, can you come up with any reason that makes sense for why the legislature would have done that without any reference to why it actually did it? And 9 times out of 10, that is sufficient to the cause. And so in a way, we are asking the judiciary to be the clerks or the AIs to the legislature when justifying the rules. But of course, it might also be that the legislative process is thought to be inherently self-legitimating because of the fact that the representatives are elected and then they took a vote. I don't, there were any other hands up. I don't know where the object has gone.
Natalie has it.
Order, but I'm going to try to let people who haven't spoken speak.
Just an idea I want to share is, what if you make the system sort of look at all the sum of human knowledge to give reasons for, and then look at, again, all that sum of knowledge to give like reasons against, and make sure that the judge sees both. Like I know that a lot of businesses, which I guess we can think of as organizations of machines made of flesh, make what they call like a blue team and a red team.
Yes.
That would consider an idea and like try to defend it as much as possible, but also attack it as much as possible.
In some case, what you're describing is, in law, and especially again in the US, the adversarial process, where it's much easier to be a judge than you might think, because you don't actually have to know the law at all. All you need to know is how to take in the briefs from each side, and the briefs are basically pre-written opinions for you to draw from, and whichever one seems most persuasive to you, you can then modify as the template for your opinion. So it's not like you just have to issue it out of whole cloth. So in a way, what you're suggesting is just, great, have the machine take in the briefs, take in all human knowledge, and then write 2 opinions, each of which is the best justification for either holding, and then just tell the judge, which opinion do you want? And you'd be down with that.
I'm saying I still see a problem with that, but I see less of a problem with it, if that makes sense, compared to.
But if it turns out the judge flipped a coin to decide which of the 2, that would be awful. But if the judge just read them and was like, you know, number 1 seems compelling, that'd be fine. And if you ask the judge, what's the reason, the judge would be like, well, read number 1 and you'll see.
And I also remember from high school debate that you would pick a topic, you would flip a coin, literally, and you choose a side, and then you would argue. And always, almost, the best debate team would win, even though we were using all the same data. So what's quite interesting about that is that, you know, given the same data, given the fact that, you know, it is a coin toss, the best algorithm wins, and and I guess I have a question, because that, you know, debate actually made me quite cynical about law. Is that the way that lawyers think about the law, that the ability to argue the case, given something that's close as a coin toss, should be the thing that, or is actually the thing that swings the thing one way or the other?
Well, I think debate may be a little bit of an artificial example, because of course the entire frame of who won the debate was who was the better debater.
Yeah.
So it's like, it turns out the better debaters kept winning all the debates. It's like, well, yes, they weren't being judged on, am I convinced that meat is murder? Mm-hmm. It was like, well, those meat is murder people were pretty good. Like, I'm gonna go have a steak with them. So that is both cynical,
Yeah.
but it's a different exercise. It would be really weird if the judge was like, frankly, I think, you know, the defense is more compelling, but the prosecution was just, that the reasons are more compelling, but the prosecution was so well argued, I gotta hand it to them. Like, congratulations, best oralist, you go to jail. Like, that is
Although
not.
I lost one debate because the judges were nuns, and even though they said we argued better, we were morally incorrect, which I thought was an unfair.
You were robbed. You were not given due process. Yeah.
I just have sort of a clarification. So with Hallie's comment that you know, the people who are doing this post facto analysis, if they disagree with something, that they can then make that known, and that you can sort of have perhaps a revision. In reality, does that ever happen where you have some judge who makes a rule or a judgment, and then you have post facto analysis to justify it, and then actually it gets reversed through that process? Does that ever actually happen?
Because it was post facto?
Well, not because, but that was just how it happened. So, because you were saying that this is something that can happen where a judge can make a ruling, and then that all of the reasoning behind that ruling is then decided or defined afterwards. But then what Hallie was saying was that, well, at least with humans, that can maybe be reverted based on human reasoning. But I want to know, does that actually ever happen?
If I'm understanding you right, which I might not be, and it gets back to the point Hallie was making, it's that at times humans can decide to depart from what, if you tried to take the sum total of the inputs, what they would point towards, the human can be like, you know what? I think the law is wrong and should change. Or even though it looks like it would apply to this autonomous vehicle this way, if we went by the law of a regular vehicle, there should be different rules for autonomous vehicles because they're better than human cars, or capable of it. So humans are able to not just predict an outcome of somebody just doing pattern matching, what they would say, but actually refactor their reasoning. Now machines could do that too, I suppose. Is this the kind of thing in which a human would refactor, would be the prediction to make. But that does happen, and different courts or decision makers have different license in the system to do so. The highest court of a jurisdiction maybe feels much more comfortable departing from whatever the rule is if it was one made by a prior court, whereas the ones underneath, there's, I think, a conflict in jurisprudence about a conception of those, quote, lower court judges as to whether, if they personally disagree with the wisdom of it, should still follow what they think the law points to, or if at least you could come up with good reasons on either side and be a good debater about it, go with the thing that feels right.
Should we push the plunger?
Yeah, it feels like Wheel of Fortune. What will we get?
So let's define these and describe these. How are they different? What do they mean?
The next 6 hours will be devoted.
Well, we've already spent 45 minutes
point.
on the first slide. But I mean, I don't think we need to go super deep, but I do think it's important to realize that we sometimes use these terms interchangeably, but they're actually fairly different, right? So we were talking about transparency, which I think there was some readings. I think there was one that wasn't in the readings, but Lawrence Lessig has a very lucid account, especially being on the Sunlight Foundation board. But his whole point is that human beings are not very good at differentiating between correlation and causality, and that just things like and that interpretability of the data is difficult.
He wrote an article called Against Transparency.
Yeah.
And in part, too, it's funny, we're just keeping the theme of just going with the justice system for the moment. While judges owe reasons, it's sort of interesting that once they give their reasons, the system requires them to shut up. It's not like they then take interviews and talk about more, people get to complain. There's an appellate process maybe, but there's some interesting build of the system towards finality. And of course, when we use juries, we try to avoid them giving any reasons whatsoever.
So I think one obvious one, and then we can maybe open up a little bit more, is transparency without understandability is probably not that useful, right? We would agree on that. And I think that that's this, denial of service attack that I often get on boards, where people just give you reams of data that don't really give you the ability to parse them. So understandability.
Which is a cognitive denial of service attack.
Cognitive denial of service attack. And also actually a form of misdirection, because the way in which you present the data affects the way people might interpret it. And so just pure transparency is probably not enough unless you are a data scientist who knows how to dig your way through all of those things, like Julia Angwin. Any other thoughts on how they're maybe different? What's ultimately the most important?
To sort of go back on the point of transparency, I think there's transparency on the end of the person who's sort of in the criminal justice system being convicted against or for. But there's also the element of the user who's interacting with the system. And so what you currently have is these judges who who may not have the technical competency or understanding of what this system is actually doing, but simply using the end product or the end solution. And so there's transparency not in how is this decision being made about me, but how is the system that I'm using actually making this decision to help me. So it's sort of a two-way street where you have two end users and you want to address both.
And to just sort of double click on that, in the New York case with the DNA tests, it could be that they were being explained very well, but because of lack of transparency, third-party experts couldn't come and audit the thing. And so while they may have been explained, because of the lack of transparency, they weren't being open. And so maybe there are certain cases where transparency is an essential part of the auditing process.
I think to answer your question about which one is more important, I see them as you need to have all of them. Without one, the framework falls apart. And so it's like this, to me, we're talking about due process. These words are the framework for how we are making machine learning algorithms have a feedback loop. Before, we would just make an algorithm, okay, that's it. Data scientist says they're done. But really, it's more about like what is the effect in the world and how do I go back to improve on it. And so this framework needs all of those. Without one, it falls apart. So I think that would be that would be my answer.
In all circumstances.
So although I agree that they are all important, as I think more of just the state of tech and especially recent tech, I think of all those items up there, unless you have accountability, none of the other things matter. You can be transparent all day long and make it understandable and make it so everyone you can interpret it and everyone can understand and you explain it so clearly, but at the end of the day, if the individuals who are developing the code, if the individuals who are leading the teams, if individuals who are running those companies, who are leaking the data, if they're not held accountable, I don't think any of that actually matters. So I think you can probably do with one or the other, or it's good to have all, but unless accountability is there, you'll just have like a nice world where people explain data and show what's
But can I just be clear, we started, because the opening bid from Gretchen was procedural due process, we started naturally limiting ourselves to government decisions that affect people's lives, because that's when due process kicks in. And that it's like, okay, you got to give some reasons. We have all this formal structure, which we limened a little bit. But now, once we're on this slide, it sounds like we're talking about any technology, any system. I mean, if I buy Silly Putty, and then I play with it, and somehow I can like put it down on something, and it copies the comic strip over, I mean, good times. Like, none of these things, I have no idea how this shit works. And if I ask them, they're like, trade secret. Like, well, but then you're not accountable. It's like, how little in the world do we demand this of private parties? And are you thinking all of this is owed by private parties to one another so long as they're using executable code? Is that the...
I think it's evident that private parties don't hold each other to these standards.
Yes.
They may say that users hold us accountable and like that's enough, et cetera. I think we're at a point where something, either it's regulation or something else has to step in to hold some groups accountable.
And I mean, I'm not trying to be difficult. I'm just trying to understand how radical a departure from the status quo and under what circumstances we want to take. And as you were just hinting at, among private parties, there's a form of accountability called the market.
Yes.
And if your Silly Putty is not fun, no one will buy it, and that's that. If it turns out to hurt people, that they might have to answer for. In a lawsuit, there would be a discovery process. What a great word, discovery. Doesn't it sound like a pot of gold? It just means like reams of documents get disclosed, and the lives of first-year associates are never returned to them. But that is an interesting moment where after there's been an alleged credible harm by one private party against another, some of these things actually do kick in either through an adversarial process or a more inquisitorial process of like a Consumer Product Safety Commission looks into something. So maybe there are instances then where we bring these to bear with the demonstration of harm somehow being the predicate, that if there is no demonstrated harm, you can keep all the trade secrets you want. I don't know.
And since Silly Putty was invoked, we will now hand it to the philosopher in the back. Because there may be harm in what you just...
Yeah, I was thinking that the accountability part can be separated pretty substantially from some of this other stuff because, for example, and so I think this is relevant to what Jay-Z's talking about, we have ways, first of all, if you're thinking about what justice requires, some conceptions of what justice requires will say the process has to be fair in certain ways or things like that. But some people say, no, all we care about is how the outcome looks. And sometimes we think you need both, but there's this whole other zone that's like, well, what was the outcome? And that's when we start asking these questions about harm. And I was thinking that, especially given stuff that came up in the readings and that's come up in earlier sessions of the course where we think that there are going to be maybe some limits to transparency and some of these other things, and we might really want to look at this more outcome-based possibility. And we, of course, have tools like in the law, we already have the certain categories where what we're interested in is disparate impact. So we say, look, here's something that would be bad if certain groups are disadvantaged. We don't even then care what you thought you were doing or what you meant to be doing or how it got there. It's just bad because this is harming some groups differentially. And sometimes it would just be that it's harming anybody at all. If your Silly Putty turned out to be poison, then that's probably bad. But so it seems like questions about accountability, it's often going to be tempting to think that we have to do that in terms of process. But I just wanted to flag that we might sometimes, for various reasons, want to think more about, well, we can look at outcomes and do really important things there, testing what makes a difference to this algorithm, whether we know how it's getting there or not. But if it's making a difference what race of the person is, then that's going to be bad, or things like that. So
it's kind of an interesting counterpart to Kathy's original point, because as I understood Kathy's original point, it was you can have the first four. You absolutely need those in order to support accountability, but if you have them without the accountability, no ability to do anything about it, you're stuck. And you're kind of saying, well, how about if you had the accountability without the first 4? Would that be okay? And I don't know, that's a provocative counter back.
And it does lead to conversations later about unexplainable but utilitarian outcomes from machines, right?
Yes.
I just wanted to present an example where it is the government. You have transparency, understandability, interpretability, and explainability by some definition, but think what this definition means. Think about the federal tax code. I'm a former tax lawyer, and I can tell you that no one in the room, even if secretly we've got a tax partner in the room, no one understands individually the entire federal tax code. But they understand sections. It's all printed, very skinny paper, small print, and mostly only accessed online now. But I mean, it is transparent, understandable in chunks to experts, interpretable, explainable. It affects everyone all the time. It can send you to jail. It can take away all your money. But it also sort of goes along okay. So when you look at the first 4, who exactly needs to be able to understand it and how much of it at a time? Because it may be similar in complexity, what we're ultimately asking.
And of course, the tax code could be arbitrarily complex or simple. But I imagine if you ask a similar question about, I want to operate a business that makes silly putty, there's no one person that knows all of the relevant things you need to do and not do in order not to be breaking the law as you buy a property, hire accountants, do all. But does that trouble you? Or is it okay that, like, no, it's just great employment for accountants, lawyers, and consultants, and among all of them, the understanding is there to do it?
I think it doesn't trouble me that the first 4 will not be, that they will not apply broadly to the general public. If they are not accessible in overlapping chunks to some subclass that is not the private, sort of owners of this IP, then that might be troubling. But
and isn't it true? I'm not sure if accountability encapsulates it for me, but just another question to the lawyers. I mean, aren't all of these things supposed to be in service of making society better? And the extent to which they work in service of that, I can see how they make sense. And I think having rule of law and things like that make you feel. But I sometimes look at the United States, which is very legal compared to, say, Japan, where it's much more of it quacks like a duck. I don't really care what your law says. You're bad, and that has its own problems. But it also has this thing where, if in the United States, I do find a lot of well, it's legal, so it's okay. And if you look at like the paper about the FICO scores, where they're sort of skirting around the rules to do things that are causing harm, and knowingly doing so, because they've followed due process and all the different rules that have been, and so that the ability to generate the rules quickly enough is required in order to make sure that you're not harming. And so it's interesting because when you look at the tax code, I mean, it should be optimizing for some social good. And the ability for us to understand whether it's causing harm or not is sort of at a different layer than any of that, right? Because the transparency in that stuff is kind of whether you can go into microscope. Okay, we're going to go with who has the mic.
Yeah, I was going to add on to the point about making society better, and then also your point when you were mentioning outcomes. I thought it was interesting the direction that you took it, because when I was looking at this list, I was thinking further down the line of what does this point to, and the idea that accountability on its own is somewhat useless as just a concept, because you can say, okay, I'm accountable for some act, but unless there is some penalty or some blame associated to that, in the legal sense of a liability or some damages or injunctive relief, then there is no change in behavior. I guess that's the end goal of whatever system or whatever means that you want to get there to. And so my question would be for specifically technology sense of, okay, where do those changes in behavior start to align to a system that holds those parties accountable, whether that's users, whether that's other companies, until that system itself has created delineated goals or terms or rules of play, or even just end goals of the purpose of that said means, then it seems like all of these different aspects that are further up the chain don't necessarily have their own intrinsic purpose. If that makes sense.
I'm not sure if this is exactly what you're saying, but people that go around and ignorantly harm society, let's just call the platforms, we didn't know, and making people accountable for mistakes that they've made. It sort of reminds me of the criminal justice system. Is it deterrence?
Yeah.
Is it retribution? Is it trying to take that harmful person out of the system? Because if you think about systems design, if we're trying to actually make society better, so accountability is obviously a really valuable tool when you have people who are knowingly doing things in the system and you're trying to make sure that you're preventing knowing bad behavior. But if you have a system that's evolving very quickly and everybody's trying to do the right thing, what does accountability look like and mean in that sense? And what does it mean to be accountable when you don't have, if you're an engineer and you have no background in social science or law, and you're doing the best that you can, what does that mean?
And I think I'll add on just that some of the reading mentioned accountable for what and accountable to whom. And I think the whom has not necessarily been expressed well, because there are many different nationalities, diverse populations that have different understandings of what these systems should do. And so it becomes an even more fraught concept of accountability when you start to put the who in there.
Which I should say is maybe clarifying a couple things here. The first is that procedural due process, which again we latched onto quickly, is itself not a guarantor of the right socially optimal result. It just would be a way of understanding what the hell is going on, and then somebody should decide whether that's a good thing. You could implement a rule that people who make fun of the president get killed, like death penalty for making fun of the president, and you could administer that rule with perfect due process and be assured that you are being executed and here are your reasons, and you did make fun of the president and it has been shown. And then the view on that would be, oh, well, that's a bad law. That's wrong. That shouldn't be. That's a different layer at which you would review that. And that gets to, I think, the accountability piece, which is, as you say, it's just fixing a locus of who gets to either make sure that whatever you're supposed to be doing, you are doing, you're not deviating from the structure. And second, is this the right structure? And I feel like accountability is, whoever is answering that question is the party to whom accountability, with whom accountability rests. I guess that's the way to put it. Sorry, I don't know if Kathy wants to get back in or. Oh yeah.
Well, so I had a quick comment on the scope of these things. So we were talking about accountability without the other ones. And I think, there's transparency into the process and as well as the other terms, but there's also the results. We're kind of taking the results for granted that we know what the results are. But there are countries where you don't know how many people are going to jail and of what classifiers they are of. So if we, at minimum, even in a system where we're relying on disparate impact, if we need to have transparency into the results of these systems and their operations. So we can't wholly do without the first four.
Mm-hmm. 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 And let's do Gary and then Kathy and then move to the next slide. Or you've got one there, okay.
So I was still trying to get my head a little bit around the difference between just something that is transparent but not understandable. And I understand you give the 900-page example, I think, of something that's transparent but not understandable, if I understood that right.
Yeah.
And I think the thing that was confusing to me, though, is okay, so say it's on page 128 or something, and that's why it's transparent, because I could find it. But then, what if I just encrypted it, and, you can still decrypt it, you just have to find this 128-bit number to decrypt my thing. But I think we would call the encrypted thing not transparent and not understandable. And so is there some argument that, okay, it's transparent if, you can do it at linear time, because we're just linear, but, it's encrypted, so now it's an exponential time solve, and that's the difference between
Well,
Like
one is also, I think, again, this gets into a little bit of the correlation versus causation. So one of the arguments that Larry makes is, if in Sideline Foundation, you make transparent the funds that are donated to politicians. And people will assume that if you get money from tobacco, that you're voting tobacco. But he shows that that's not necessarily true. And that inference, actually, by people who don't know how to interpret the data, who aren't aware of how to understand it, are still getting very transparent data, but that causality isn't well understood or explained, and again, it's nuanced because it's not like, and his point was you need experts in the system that interpret the data that's being presented in a transparency system to help guide public opinion around how to interpret that information. I mean, that's one piece. And then I would also say, like, we'll see in the machine learning sections, like, even if you could see the weights, and it's sort of almost encrypted, but it's not on purpose. You could see the weights of all the hidden layers of a deep neural network. Well, that is pretty transparent, but you're going to need some tools in order to understand what that means. Is it the obligation of the person creating the neural network to translate that out into a way that's understandable to your framework, right? Because to a machine, it's totally understandable, and it's not encrypted. So I think there are variants to that. I don't know if...
I was just saying, I know we've got one more comment. I wonder if we shouldn't gear up to do our case studies among our tables.
Yeah.
But
Gary, do you want to? Yeah, go ahead.
So I was just thinking, and I apologize, I don't know our philosophers. Abby and Gretchen's comments about due process and accountability reminded me of a real live public policy debate in 2016 about the financial crisis. As we all know in this room, very few senior executives of Wall Street went to jail. And so it came, very few being maybe zero. and so it came to a head of a public policy debate around how much due process is really a good thing. And one sticky point as a non-lawyer's point of view of scienter. Does it matter the state of mind, the thinking, the intent, the knowledge? And Eric Holder, the former Attorney General, actually said in his speech, well, maybe we should shift this over. Maybe we need to change our laws. And so it's where accountability, maybe a per se liability, maybe somebody should have gone to jail just because 10 million people lost their jobs. Somebody from Wall Street, and that could have been an AI system instead of humans. That would have been strict accountability, as Abby might have been, or maybe it's more in the due process caucus. And it reminds me, because in the middle of the Hillary campaign, we had debates, even with Hillary, about should we take Eric's idea and move and be publicly more for accountability and maybe dial back on due process, at least in this scienter knowledge place.
take the guns first.
What's that?
It was when the current president offered up the idea and quickly walked it back of taking guns, due process later. I don't know if you remember that.
Yeah, I was thinking about it in another context, but yes, they have overlaps.
Yes.
All right, shall we move on? Is that okay? All right. So do you want to just munch forward to the
Yeah, I
cases?
think we should actually.
Okay.
Unless you wanted to say a couple words.
Yeah, maybe we'll just jump. I mean, I think just most of these were in the readings, so I don't think we need to go into a lot of detail, but I think the point is that there is progress being made on trying to explain neural networks by looking at the hidden layers and figuring out how to describe them. We can corner Jesse later to figure out how an explainable deep neural network might be more susceptible to adversarial attacks and things like that. But the paper, if you, was this in the readings? No. This one, we'll send the link around later, but I kind of love it because it actually has this mouse over where you can see the layers in the deep neural network and kind of see how the machine is looking at them. And what's useful about it, that is you kind of get a sense of, oh, this is pretty cool because you can sort of see what it's seeing about the picture that makes it thinks it's a cat. And clearly you can probably tell if it's looking at the copyright statement in the corner or if it's looking at the cat itself. So some of the obvious problems are probably auditable through this, but I think it falls a little short of being called explainability, right?
And yeah, for those of you who were fortunate enough to be at Gretchen and Aisha's table when Aisha was explaining how non-explainable neural net judgments can be, this is maybe a test of to what extent some systems can talk about why they thought a cat was a cat because it had ears, and other systems are like, it's a cat because the pixels looked like these kinds of pixels, without any other kind of components identifiable. And when it's the latter, it's hard for it to explain why a cat is a cat. What?
And we talked about GDPR already, but I think that we don't have to go very deep into this, but it clearly is a great aspiration. But I think the analysis is that the fact that the minute the human is involved, it sort of alleviates a bunch of the restrictions is a loophole. And it doesn't seem like it's going to be very enforceable in its current form. I don't know. I think the New York City Council one was, I don't know if this was in the readings, I think it was. No, it's the New York City Council actually. I think it was one of the first cities, I guess we've been trying to do this in Massachusetts, but that came out and started calling for, did they actually pass a bill? I think they did, right? Yeah, that calls for.
Watered down.
Huh?
Watered down.
It's watered down, which happens with most good bills. But I think it's a good first step in starting to see, and I think the city is actually a great place to start because you actually have people that are engaged, you have city council people who tend to be engaged from the perspective of the people, but I think we should be tracking this as a layer, and weirdly probably more effective sometimes than something like the EU level stuff. Cases.
All right, so what we want to do is, how many tables do we actually have or are capable of generating? Do we have roughly?
Yeah, if
9?
you're on a small table,
Together.
move and clump a little bit to
Also, back table with 3 philosophers, you guys are going to scatter. Originally we had, we want everybody to kind of have
3 philosophers is a conspiracy.
Yeah, I mean, try to self-select groups that look like diverse.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And Natalie, are you going to designate which tables are doing this one? Yeah. Okay. And then is the next slide the further explication of this? Yeah. The slide I sent you. Oh, so this is an old deck. Okay, I'll just remember it. Yeah.
The temperature.
All right, somehow this became a break. I'm not sure how that happened. Shall we reassert ourselves as a class? All right, so for some of you, for each of these cases, we have 3 cases we basically want you to discuss. Each of you will discuss one of them. Each table will discuss one of them. And so this is case number 1. And you may remember this, I think I glancingly mentioned it in my opening lecture. That was unexpected. My opening lecture, which was the half-baked attempt by Admiral Insurance in the UK to encourage people to connect up their Facebook accounts, authorizing the Admiral app to graze through the account. And the Admiral app, in turn, would gather information that would not appear to be relevant directly to how safe a driver you are, but thanks to previous apparent machine learning style computing, Admiral had used its own actuarial database and correlations with a training set of Facebook accounts linked to people who had and hadn't had accidents to associate features like meeting people at a particular time and place rather than just tomorrow. And it could scan through your Facebook posts as you arrange with your friends to meet and determine whether you're somebody who is specific on time or vague. And if you're vague, it might mean that you're more likely to have an accident and you won't get the discount. So the idea would be there's a sticker price for Admiral Insurance. If you hook up the app, they may be willing to give you a discount. You can take a roll of the dice. If they don't like what they see, you'll still pay the sticker price. So you won't be excluded from insurance or have a price increase. It can only lower your cost, but we understand that the kinds of things it will base the lowering on are at best proxies for your safe driving. Maybe the next slide will have it actually. You want to just, yeah, here it is, and just click one more time. Yeah, these include writing in short, concrete sentences, using lists, and arranging to meet friends at a set time and place rather than just tonight. So I'm curious for the tables that are just about to be assigned to take up this case, in light of the list of words we had up before, transparency, understandability, explainability, accountability, all that kind of stuff, is there any problem with this business as I've just described it? And if so, what is the problem and what might fix it if problem it is? Is that a sensible portrayal of this case? Natalie, which tables are doing this? The two front tables. Congratulations, admirals. You are on the case. All right, next case.
Next case. And
uh-oh. There we are.
Okay. Medicine. So this is actually based on some research that we have going on at the Media Lab. And we have found diagnostics. So you look at images. The machines look at images, and they are able to identify or diagnose diseases or issues that we can't yet explain. So they somehow are looking at something, and maybe someday we will be able to explain it. We're starting to guess that they're looking at certain types of capillary flows, things that human beings wouldn't traditionally look at, and that one hypothesis is that they're just things that we haven't discovered yet. We don't have the ability to explain it using modern medicine, but by taking lots of numbers and munching them together, we are able to start to make correlations, but not yet explain them. And then what we've also found is, and I have to obfuscate this a little bit because it's not published, but there's a matching of drugs and therapies that also are completely counterintuitive and go against the traditional wisdom of human beings on how you would treat these diseases. And we have, using lots of data, we have theoretical models that show that they are actually, in fact, work out well. And they can do interesting trade-offs that humans can't do, which is how can we maximize for effect, less stress on the person by not bringing them into the hospital as often, and trying to reduce harmful side effects. So machines tend to be able to optimize for multivariable things better than humans, especially in precision medicine. So we have, let's just say, diagnostic and therapeutic tools that are unexplainable, that have a fairly reasonable amount of data to allow us to assume that they probably work, but aren't even scientifically, they don't even make sense really from a science perspective. So the question is, going back to transparency, accountability, and all these other things, should they be allowed? Who should decide? What kind of accountability, explainability? And again, it's somewhat of a continuum. There are probably some things in that portfolio of things that some doctors might have a hunch and say, hey, these sound reasonable. These look completely ridiculous, but the data is showing that they have effects. Should we use them? Whose decision should it be? So that's sort of roughly the space. How do we regulate, in terms of accountability and transparency and governance, therapies and diagnostics that are currently unexplainable by medicine or science? So should we do the next two tables over? Okay.
Oh, wait, I think they're already assigned to. Those two.
The back corner? Yeah. Okay, so then we have three tables left for. And the remote table. Oh, okay. What's that?
Yeah, the remote table can also be
okay. Wait, so let's just be clear. Which tables? Raise your hand if you're medicine, and then we'll confirm whether, we'll validate whether that's true. Those two? Okay. Those two are medicine. These two are insurance. Okay. And then the last one, I think Jay-Z and I will do together. My friend Dara's problem. So everybody saw the news. Uber self-driving car killed a pedestrian yesterday. So that's has suddenly made into reality that which has been theoretical. So do you want to frame the question?
Sure. So we know very little about this situation yet, which is helpful intellectually for the purpose of being able to have a case with not a lot of facts to master. What we do know is that the self-driving car possibly tried to throw it to the driver, but there was basically very little time for it to react. It may be the case that no car, just given the physics of the situation, could have stopped at the moment it was apparent there was a pedestrian. The real question, I think, for the tables so selected is what form of explanation do we require, if any, from the car, from its software, as to why it did or didn't stop? And depending on what would count as an acceptable explanation, what form of change would be required in the software for all cars or something to account for any, quote, mistake? Or is it sufficient, a la the disparate impact point, to simply judge the car according to how a human driver would react, and it either fell short of that or it exceeded that? And so long as it didn't fall short, what was going on inside the software of the car, is that irrelevant? I'm curious how to think through what we want to extract from the algorithms in the car. And then Joey, I think, has an add-on having to do with the trolley problem.
Yeah, and I would let's just also make this problem a little bit more abstract in this particular thing, in that I think some of you may have heard that it didn't slow down and so on. Let's just make this an abstract thing and say, for all pedestrian accidents, let's generalize what our solution would be rather than just try to figure out what the problem with this was. Because that lets me put the other piece into this, which is the, I think, 2014 patent that I showed from Google, which has this wonderful list of things, including hitting a pedestrian, getting hit by a truck, running over things, and it rank orders the likelihood and the amount of a cost it would be and the risk. Then it weights the risks and does the trolley problem in an algorithm that is in a patent. So let's assume that this machine has something like that already built in. A weighting system on where it is in the lane, how fast it's going, based on the cost-benefit analysis of all the various trade-offs that it's making. And how would we think about that in this context as well?
All right. Should we say 12 minutes? I think we've just
did.
said 12 minutes. All right. See you in 12 minutes.
Okay. Okay, start wrapping up your conversations and get ready for an explainable, understandable report out on each of your things. So, Jay-Z, do you want to run the first?
All right, so
Write unruly characters.
Let's start with our admirals. So the first lords of the Admiralty over here, tell us the basic problem, if any. Are you cool with this? It says that's the no consensus laugh.
I think there were two things that we kind of pinpointed that we were, no, maybe more, that we were not cool with. The first being, if the model that they talk about is actually fully transparent, then it becomes manipulatable. So now if I know that I can use if I use less exclamation points, I'll get a better score, then maybe I can now start doing that. Mm-hmm. And this becomes a problem for the companies.
So this is where if we want it to be effective, it has to remain non-transparent.
Yeah, so there's a trade-off there. And then we also talked about, yes, this may not be causing direct harm in terms of it won't hurt you if you decide not to use the model, but there could still be harms in terms of bias. So if certain populations, for instance, maybe you don't speak, you don't write in English when you post on Facebook, you might get dinged by this model, and then there's a bias there.
Uh-huh.
Do you want to talk about the one that you mentioned?
Oh, yeah. So a few other things that we talked about, I'll start with Max's idea of even if the factors that are being inputted into the model are transparent, the fact that you didn't know when you were generating your Facebook like feed or kind of like making these posts, that part isn't transparent because you didn't know what this data was going to be used for or that it would be useful at all.
It sounds a lot like the Cambridge Analytica issue that we've all been thinking about.
Yeah.
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 I feel like this is Cambridge Analytica, just in a very applied money kind of way. Yeah.
Yeah.
Got it. And that's not fair, you think, even if it is accurate.
Yeah, that's
And even if you are willing to retroactively consent in the hopes of getting your discount, you will not be permitted to then, in your view?
Yeah, it's something that, Max, do you want to talk a bit about it?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think there's an interesting way in which we just feel this disgust to the certain kind of market intervention in these certain kind of personal aspects of our lives. I think there's a deep relation between these kinds of choices where we don't want to be even offered the choice at all. So kind of in comparison to kind of kidney markets, this is what Alvin Roth talks a lot about in terms of why we don't want to have markets everywhere. When we make, it seems like you'd never be worse off.
But there are insurance markets.
Right, but they don't use everything, right? And we're uncomfortable with the fact that they might use everything.
Last question, could they use things that don't have to do with automobile safety, but might have to do with safety generally or something?
I mean, they use things that don't have anything to do with safety generally. They use what occupation you are or how much money you make. That's already being used by every insurance company.
Not in America, but this is UK anyway, so who knows? Right, so you're cool with that or you're not cool with that?
I guess I just assumed that that was standard. To have
Supposing they
basic
used
demographics.
occupation, are you fine with using occupation, just don't use my Facebook posts?
Feels different to me. So I'm more comfortable with basic demographic information.
I love how your Facebook account might have your occupation in it. You're like, now that's going too far. But if you tell me separately your occupation, okay.
Or they use my age, for example.
Uh-huh. Got it. Should we go to the other set of Facebook admirals?
Do you see what just happened here? Yeah, I think our primary discussion was centered around the ways in which that this could easily turn into a Cambridge Analytica situation, right? And so like the stakeholders here that we're interested in are not just the insurance company and just the people seeking lower rates, but it's also all of these other parties involved. Like I think the reason why the Cambridge Analytica story was so big was that it wasn't just your data, it was all of your friends' data who did not necessarily consent to sharing their information with this third-party app. And that could be like a great potential source of harm, especially if...
But in this case, that's talking about Cambridge Analytica. In this case, with the Admiralty Admiral app, so long as it's only using your data, but to be sure it was trained on a bunch of other people's data, are you okay with that? You're just worried that it might get extended, but in the baseline, are you okay with it?
No.
Council is saying no.
No. No, we're still not okay. I think we also had a large discussion about what kind of data even is this to judge your driving, right?
It's data that appears to correlate with accidents.
Well, we had talked about also how, well, it seemed that they had proof that it's data that appears to correlate with accidents, so that alone itself is also questionable. And then additionally, something else that was brought up was, well, what if people, are you okay with companies just buying data about you, or buying data about your purchase history or something else? And is that okay? I'm sorry?
I remember the company.
Yeah, and is it okay to buy, are you okay with buying purchase history
Yes.
and not okay with like them mining your text? And that also brought up a discussion around just the technology used for text mining in general and how that's different than like unstructured data versus structured data and having a company analyze types of words or slang or somebody else had mentioned if you use a different language, and there's also a lot that comes with analyzing text in general as well. So we found that problematic.
So it sounds like, if I can try to crystallize the worry, it's that even Admiral might know that it's going to get things wrong and perhaps fail to offer discounts to people who ideally it would offer discounts to, but because they're using the wrong language or there's some other issue where their model isn't very well refined, it doesn't offer the discount. And that alone is enough to repudiate the model as far as you're concerned.
I think if so what another stakeholder brought up is the directors of the board or of management. Because if I'm a manager, that's the question I'm asking in a slightly different way, which is, am I going to lose out on customers because I don't give them a discount?
Right.
Like, and I'm not. If I were, I don't know, VP of product or whatever the person might be, I'm questioning whether this actually works and whether we continue to build on it.
Yes, for which, from a point of view of market discipline, it only has to work better than what you have now, which is to say to selectively offer some discounts to some people who are really good risks, that it doesn't bring them down to their marginal new known risk to maybe be worth it, even if it's not offering discounts to other people who then will choose, progressive because the price is the same kind of thing. But otherwise, you could see it helping on the margin. And I was just, last question, and then we should move to the other groups. It's very common to do a group rate. AARP or MIT might have a special group rate for insurance. And I guess by sheer status quoism, we might likely find ourselves, if not fine with it, not disgusted by that. Would it be okay if there was a Facebook group rate so that members of certain Facebook groups are offered better rates if that Facebook group is actuarially deemed to be safer? And of course, it would have to be, as this table was saying, maybe retroactive, so there can't be a huge rush to join the horticultural enthusiasts group because they tend to drive pretty slowly.
Well, I think it's dangerous if the groups, you can imagine that they end up correlating with some such sensitive attributes that you don't actually see, but because of how the neural network is working, if you were to open up the black box, it would reveal that there's something kind of not copacetic going on under the hood.
Which could be true with MIT.
It could be, maybe. But yeah, I don't know. Do you think that's the same? Or
There's a marketing dimension in here too. When Progressive says, "Hey, I'm going to offer an MIT rate," when Progressive says it's going to offer an MIT rate, they're doing a calculation of, okay, we offer this rate, we get this much marketing, and that's probably driving the decision as much as people. Because I imagine MIT is a very diverse place because the same rate is likely offered to the oldest of the professors emeritus to the youngest of the undergrad.
Yes.
I'm exaggerating.
Yes.
So I think that's different because it's more of a marketing decision than it may be an actuarial one.
Interesting. They could just promise that it's only marketing when they offer to the Facebook group. But okay, I think we need to move to the next problem. But thank you both for teeing this up.
So we have 10 minutes and 4 groups left. So.
No. Well, yeah. I guess technically 4 tables. Yeah.
So. Go for it. Oh.
So I think our immediate reaction was that, for the most part, these kinds of ML applications for healthcare do not significantly change the existing paradigm around healthcare. That is, sort of culturally, we've already chosen to maybe ignore the first 4 of those criteria in favor of accountability, in the sense that although medicine is a science, it's not always absolutely well understood, and the pathways between treatment and outcome are not super clear. So to that degree, a model is no different. I think where we started to get more complicated was the idea that for things which are not pharmaceutical in nature, which cannot be sort of clinically tested, like decision support tools for clinicians, for example, there begins to become more of a gray area where it's not clear who is accountable or exactly why decisions are being made. Is that fair?
Well, I think, and I'm not an expert here, but I do think, though, that doctors have some duty of explainability, right? I think you have to be able to explain why you've made certain decisions, if I understand correctly. And then also just even if the drug is actually approved, it's approved to be administered in a certain way. And I think one of the protocols that we find that machines are doing is to take approved drugs but administer them in unconventional ways. And I think a doctor would tell you, I'm going to give you a double dose because X. Whereas a machine will say because.
Honestly, I don't know. I'd want to locate the duty of explainability you think doctors have. As best I can tell, again, from a tort context.
Well, look at malpractice.
That's what I was just about to say. From a tort context, malpractice is, do other doctors think the first doctor did a decent decision? And none of them might be able to explain it. Each of them on the stand would be like, look, all I can tell you is I've been a doctor for 46 years, and damn it, leeches are not a good idea. And, well, why not? I just don't think they work. And that doctor, and they got 4 other experts to say it shouldn't have been a leaching. I don't think you need an etiology of leaching, although you might.
But I do think that, and I don't want to go too far in the weeds, but I think if you're following a protocol that's given to you by the hospital or the drug company, you have some cover. But if you deviate from protocol, or override the protocol.
What's the explainability of the protocol?
Well, this is the weird thing about medicine, right? I think is that you have a process of getting drug approval, which may or may not actually, in fact, represent the truth. But this is why it's kind of interesting, because these machines are probably finding interesting things that aren't coming out through the process. So there's a due process in hospitals where the committee comes up with a protocol and says, this is what we do, we just do it this way.
It's true, it's highly domain specific, but as best I know in American law and practice for medicine, physicians can prescribe medicine off-label and say, this thing is prescribed for baldness, but if you want to try it for indigestion, like...
And I guess I'm just asking the torts lawyer, are you more protected, though, if you aren't doing
You're more protected because you would show it's clearly the custom within your profession to follow this protocol, and somebody came up with it, so,
So it may not be explainability, but at least it's justification.
That's true. There are reasons.
We did separately discuss the cases of pharmaceutical, clinical trials and medical practice. And actually in the former, we thought that it was kind of a black box where, if you don't have any kind of false negatives type there, where, and the medicine just always has no failures, then we take that as good. And in that sense, we only look at accountability.
I think we're also a little bit more okay with the concept of using a black box in medicine than we are in, say, law, because in medicine, the direction of the outcomes we're looking for are all in the same way, whereas in law, we're actually trying to separate with this binary decision of good or bad. And in medicine, it's kind of clear that the outcomes for all the patients, we're hoping they're good. So in that sense, if it works, then it's more justified.
Assuming you don't have weird incentives. I remember there was a incentive for doctors to prescribe a certain drug because they were getting research funding for prescribing the drug, or there are biases that can exist, but yes, I think that's...
Which could be judged against outcomes.
Okay, next group. Same question. And feel free to build on the previous group.
Yeah, we went and we actually explored this idea a little bit of incentives. And so when you're working with a doctor, you hope at least that there's a clear incentive. The doctor's working with you to try to make you better, or as well as you can be, and that they're not getting free vacations from the drug companies. That's not clear with the algorithm. Effectively, the algorithm is performing a large-scale clinical trial, and it's not clear for whose benefit that is. So that's something that concerned us. We're not sure of the algorithm's point of view, its interest.
And I guess the question also just, how much of this should be the patient's choice in all of this is another question I have.
Yeah. So maybe to add to that, and going back to the concept of off-label use that's already come up. So we actually, we spent time discussing the question of, what's the most similar current case of using medicines to that kind of scenario? Is it the intended use of drugs? Is it off-label use, or is it participation in a clinical trial, perhaps? And then depending on that, what should be the standard of transparency and consent that should be required from patients to, so they know what the risks that they're accepting. I think we agreed, or sort of there was a tendency to agree that off-label use was the closest analogy. But then there was also, at least one important question analogous to the real-world case of off-label use, which is how vulnerable are patients to, doctors' authority of being convinced that simply following doctors' advice, even though the evidence base may be very weak, indeed. And in the case of, Watson, for example, if IBM runs a very powerful PR campaign about the merits of Watson's predictive algorithm, and then your doctor tells you, well, there's no clinical trial data in support of this use, but Watson tells you it's a good idea, how vulnerable are patients to this.
But I might turn this around and say, and I don't want to be disparaging of doctors, but there are 1 million life science papers every year, and most doctors can't keep up with the science. And what happens usually is you have a committee that tries to keep up with the science, that renders protocols that get updated every half a decade or so. And when you ask a doctor, why is a protocol thus? Here's some evidence, have you read the latest paper? They really can't answer your question on an evidence-based thing. And I've started poking around on this. Whereas a computer may say, well, here's all of the statistical analysis, and here's literally the clinical study and the 10 papers that are most recently written, and you decide. You have a 90% probability, and here's how I made the decision. So it could be that a computer might have better statistical description, whereas a doctor may have better historical, procedural, anecdotal explanation. And
I was just wondering if the Skypers have something to say, and then we still have one more
Skypers.
thing to do, which we might go a minute or two over.
Thank you. Hey, Kasia. Yeah.
Yes. Hello. I know, I was trying to turn up the volume, and the opposite happened.
Okay, should I talk louder or more quietly?
Louder.
Louder, okay. This may or may not work. Maybe it's my computer, I'm not sure. Yeah, so we were talking a little bit about power structures and kind of going to think about the authority of doctors and how sometimes that might actually not always be the most useful thing. I happen to be working on, we talked a little bit about some risk scores that are also, see how to say this. I'm working right now on research spring at the White House around the opioid crisis. And so I've been talking a lot with doctors over the last few weeks about introducing risk scores in their electronic health record systems around how likely it is that someone is going to be addicted to an opioid if they prescribe it. And so where does that information come from? And so on the one hand, this is terrifying, as how are they making this decision? On the other hand, I've been talking to a lot of ER doctors whose entire framework for risk assessment is they see the person come in and they make a decision on like 2 or 3 hours of sleep about whether that person is likely to get addicted to an opioid. And so we were talking a lot about the power of doctors and the power of machines and how it's not necessarily the worst thing in the world to use the power of quantitative analysis to help doctors make decisions. It's not clear why doctors are making decisions today. So that's kind of what we talked about. It's not exactly what we're supposed to talk about, I think. But Newman, if you want to jump in and say anything else too, Bobby, that'd be great.
Yeah, I would just reiterate that we feel like when everything is working as planned, if a system like Watson can make accurate predictions, that's terrific. But there's currently not things like medical boards and other codes of ethics for a machine learning system that's doing this large scale analysis. And so if something were to go awry in a system that lacks explainability, transparency, it's hard to gauge. The repercussions could potentially be much more grave.
That's great, thank you.
And I do think that some of the more successful deployments have been machines that assist doctors by saying, did you look here? Have you thought about this? And really doctors being provided with information support rather than sort of this adversarial thing, do doctors overrule the computer?
Yeah. The opioid risk score just seems fascinating
Yeah.
too, because you can see like, I'm in pain, I'd like my medicine. They're like, I wish I could, but the machine says you're going to be an addict. So, I'm going to be a Luddite, I can tell you that much. Sorry.
Do we have any more doctor teams left? No, right? So we're going to switch to the last one, which is the
autonomous
vehicles.
Cool. So I think I might be getting this wrong, but we sort of talked about a couple things. So first, just doing some research, you have over 15,000 accidents that are happening daily, and it's quite interesting to see how one autonomous vehicle accident sort of hits the news like it's crazy. And I think that sort of goes to show how, as a society, we hold these systems to a very high standard, and there's an expectation that they're nearly perfect or entirely fault tolerant. So that's one aspect that we discussed. Another was, as we sort of entertained the idea of the trolley car problem, we sort of ran into an issue where, as a society, we have no universal moral code or ethical answer to that problem, and we're at a point where we're trying to develop a system that could ideally respond to that situation. And so there's sort of a conflict of interest or a clash where we're not entirely sure how the system should respond in that case, but at the same rate, we're designing it to act in a certain way in the situation that it does arise. And then also, in terms of assessing the specific situation at hand, we think that it would be quite interesting to actually, get data about the specific incident, whether that be video data, whether that be information about the system, the weather conditions, the lighting, just the environmental system, and sort of assess if there was a mistake or a glitch in the autonomous vehicle, or if the vehicle operated as it was instructed, and our sort of disagreement is in how it chose to operate in that situation.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's one of the interesting things that's already been written about, which is we will have lots of data about this. And so I think the analysis will be more thorough than we could have in the past.
Mm-hmm. Great.
Yeah, I think it was really interesting because we started by trying to think about whether, with the autonomous vehicle situation, why our instinct is to try to explain the technological failure, and then kind of ended up in a conversation about how we would treat this if it was a human driver. Right, so we had a series of conversations, or sort of went through the steps of thinking about these different topics under the, well, should it be different? And if it was a human who was behind the wheel who had gotten into an accident and led to a death, what are the questions we would ask of the driver, the situation, the car, and then who is accountable or responsible for the death at the end of the day based on the information that we have? And so, there's this sense of, what should we hold the machine and the company that owns the machine to the same, should we scrutinize that the same way we would a human driver? But then we also ended up going down an interesting path around, well, or should we actually even hold it to higher standards because we know that it's better than, it should be better than a human making those decisions. So yeah, I think that for us, a lot of the challenge was it doesn't matter. Yes, we want to understand from the technology point of view why this happened, but also why would we treat this in any other way? The fact that there was a death caused by a car, why would we treat it any differently? And then if it was a human who was driving, and what should we do about that? Anyone else want?
Can I add one question that maybe you might?
Can I jump in, or shall I wait?
Well, maybe you can help answer the question, because I want to just make the argument that the autonomous vehicle companies will make, is that when you look overall, we will save 1 million lives if we switch to autonomous vehicles. And let's put in the hypothetical that there will be weird cases where they will just, because of the glitches in AI, kill people. And they will be things that maybe a human wouldn't have done, right? So when you look at the overall societal utility, how does that play into an individual case?
Yeah, I think it builds on what Brooke and what this other table were discussing, whether it was a glitch or whether it was standard operating procedure within the envelope. And so we talked about the context that mattered and like what went wrong. Was it software-based, hardware-based, maintenance-based? If one of the sensors didn't see the person because it hadn't been thoroughly cleaned or something like that, then the company's liable because they didn't do that and they knew that they should have. Or if they knew that within the environment that they were testing in, they weren't optimally positioned to actually see objects, then again, they're liable because they knew this and they didn't sort of counteract their deficiencies. So we talked about the context within that, and as you are pushing the envelope, if you will, right, you are, if something goes wrong, I think you need to hold yourself accountable, and so then it is the company's fault. But overall, I think we do think that this shouldn't stop us from moving forward, because ultimately, hopefully, we will be saving a lot more lives. But every time that this happens, we do need to go through this loop, this feedback system where we need to get better, and we need to have full transparency, look at all the telemetry, interpret it, explain it, and then ultimately be held accountable, whether we need to change the standards or the procedures.
And
I think we're pushing the limits of indulgence of our timing. Is there one table left that's going to get the last word? Is that where we're at?
We've got one more table.
Yep.
Sorry, can you guys hear? There's interference in someone's mic.
That's probably Joey.
It's like a what?
There's a glitch.
Maybe it's the hand mic? Okay. Oh, maybe there's feedback going there. Okay.
So we mainly focused on the incidents of the crash, and we tried to figure out what kind of data and understanding would be required of the car. So first of all, we need all the sensor data, cameras, and other sensors as well. In addition to the data, we'd also need the machine interpretation of the data. So what were the algorithmic decisions that were made based on the information that the vehicle had? And then beyond that, this is sort of an obtuse point about whether if the vehicles would be operating sort of as a multi-agent fleet, then are there other sort of global constraints that were acting on that individual vehicle that led it to that point, which digs up a whole sort of argument about like what is the algorithm optimizing for? It's obviously trying to avoid local clashes and such, but if it's optimizing for saving time, then maybe there's all these other things that are happening as part of that particular incident. And we asked an open question about whether your car can be used to testify against you in court.
Yeah, there's no Fifth Amendment protection for a car, as I understand it, about self-incrimination, especially because it would be other incrimination. Yes.
And I may have pointed this out in a previous session, but just there's an interesting case already in China where they're using cameras to give tickets to people who go onto pedestrian crossings when there's a person there. It automatically cuts them a ticket, even if they're like just over the line. And so what's happening is now people just walk with impunity. And so there are certain areas like in front of train stations where you can't even cross. The cars just avoid it because the people know that they have absolute right of way. And so it's interesting to think about how the system will be dynamically adapting to whatever we do. And I think the responsibility of accidents is going to have a tremendous effect on the way people behave around these things.
Thank you all for making this session a dynamic one. And thanks to the Skype folks. We'll see you
and thank you to
not
the AV
next week,
team.
but the week after.